So, in Spirituality of Awe, you've written several books on awe. So I'm actually curious, what brought you to this topic of awe?
Well, it really started many, many years ago in my childhood when I lost my 7-year-old brother to a series of illnesses that attacked his heart. And I was just over 2.5 years old. And the difference between life before this death and then after was like black and white. And I still have a memory, probably my first memory is of my parents crying on the couch when I was about 2.5. And my world turned upside down a lot because, of course, the loss, but also my parents just completely being upended. And my mother in particular was devastated by it. And so I kind of feel like I had my midlife crisis in a way very early on, because all of that opened me to a completely different outlook on life, with a lot more awareness of death, of the radical uncertainty of living, of the possibility that I could die, even at that young age, and that things could change radically on a dime. And so it caused a great deal of anxiety in me, and I went through a lot of panic attacks, night terrors, fears of monsters and germs, and I was in very bad shape. My father was actually taking notes on me. He was an educator at the time, very psychologically attuned. But it was my mother who was most psychotherapeutically attuned, and she referred me to a child analyst that she had known through her analyst. So thankfully she went into depth psychotherapy, and that's what started me off in not only being in total panic and paralysis over this thing, with a great deal of rage as well, as well as heaps of tears, but beginning to feel settled enough with this analyst, who seemed very seasoned, very present, to begin to look at some of these very scary unknowns as somewhat intriguing. Not all bleak. And I think that those are the moments that really started me off to think that one maybe could survive these horrific upheavals in life and possibly even thrive, like my analyst seemed to be. He's a very solid person. And so I began to move from a place of, in many ways, paralysis and terror, gradually toward intrigue, toward wondering about the radical mystery of life. And so, while other kids were maybe caught up in toys or games, I was really cooking on this stuff, and I got into stories, and I started developing my own dramas with characters and drawings and that type of thing. And I also, my dad was great with the tape recorder, so at 4 years old I was already talking spontaneously about social issues, pollution, the government, the problems we were having in the early 60s. And gradually, I moved toward being kind of fascinated by life. All that got ripped open began to become spaces for a kind of freeing of my imagination, and just a great deal of gratefulness to the people who helped support me in that process. So from terror to wonder over a sustained period of time. And actually, I was alone at that time, so I developed new relationships with the television. And there were some great shows at that time, especially science fiction. And I greatly related to these shows, like Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. Because they lit my imagination, I related to them because they were often about the radically unknown, the scary, death, but also often had messages about people finding a way to live with these paradoxes and scary places. And I really got into those shows. I mean, I could tell you some of the shows that I saw, but we probably don't have the time. But, well, one was should I tell you? I mean, one was of a monster that came out of a radio station. It was with Cliff Robertson, who was the actor. He was the radio operator. And this electrified monster just mysteriously appeared, and it grew and grew, and it started to rampage through the town. And people were terrified, and the army, the army was assembled, and the police were assembled, and they all had their guns pointed, like this is all classic sci-fi fashion. But then there's a complete change from the usual sci-fi convention. The monster peered down at them and said directly to them, "Put down your guns, go home, and contemplate the mysteries of the universe." That really stirred me. Yeah. And that's kind of the mode that I got in. But I won't deny that I still had a lot of issues. And some of these came back with quite a fury in my early graduate school time when I was very far away. I was in Georgia. I was far away from a girlfriend. And I was in a very unique program, but it was a humanistic program, wonderful people. But I think some of that threw me off, and I was challenged by a professor that I idealized a great deal to work in an asylum. And I got kind of scared by that. I think I got reactivated in terms of what I felt was maybe my own craziness that I hadn't dealt with. And it culminated in a really kind of a nervous breakdown one night. It had to do with my father coming to visit me with his young wife, who was only a year older than me. So he was a wonderful man, but you know, he did have some different approaches to dating. But instinctively, I went to a student that I really trusted, and she happened to be blind. It's like a blind seer, Tiresias. You know? And she said, "This too shall pass," which was vital for me at the time. And she referred me to a woman named Ann Guston, who was probably the most important psychotherapist in my life, existential analyst, who helped me again to stay more present with all that came up, and a lot came up, including some perceptual problems I was having, and real fears that it would all break in, all pour through the demons, as they did in one night that started this whole thing, and left me shaking the next day. But she was a hero of mine. she set me off on a path to not just kind of change my behaviors, but really to the degree I'm able to be present at any moment, like this one, which, you know, is restirring some things for me as I'm talking. But
Is that part of awe?
that's all part of awe as far as I'm concerned, because awe is about our relationship to mystery and to that which we can't control. And it's also about, well, I define it as the humility and wonder or sense of adventure toward living. But it's about growing. It's about being on that growing edge. I don't think we'd have a sense of awe if we didn't have some anxiety about what's going to happen next. What could we be going into? Those are all signs of possibility and growth. And they're exciting, potentially exciting, if one can be present to them. And that's, I think, one of the most important things I learned, that kind of the flip side of the terror of being in a free fall in a groundless place is all the freedom that's there. Freedom of imagination, freedom of contact with one's feelings, thoughts, body sensations, intuitions. There's so much that is freed in the sort of unbounded. But it also gave me a great deal of humility about the powers of you could say, the unconscious. I would say the groundlessness of existence.
Does it take courage to experience awe?
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of revisitation to those scared places. A lot of practice being with one's fears, but also being with one's risks. And I really see psychotherapy in many ways, or good psychotherapy, as a staging ground for cultivating awe, because one deeply discovers or rediscovers humility, actually being crushed. But at the same time, one discovers taking the chance, whether that's reaching out with the therapist, to the therapist supporting the client to express himself, herself, to go with what is emerging, you know, what you're desiring, as well as what's holding you back, that basic battle. And so it's a staging ground. I mean, you're going back and forth between really being in contact with almost being a nothing, and gradually being in more and more contact with possibilities and how you want to really live your life, what really matters in your life, and a growing capacity to be with all the thoughts and feelings and imaginings, rather than just restricted range. It helped me in so many ways, and it helped me to blossom in graduate school. I had trouble in other schools earlier, and I think it really is behind my writing, my speaking, my allowing my passions to come through, and in some way recognizing that with all of my flaws and foibles, vulnerabilities, I'm not going to let that stop me. And in fact, hopefully let that inform me, as to living a fuller life. And now, as you may even observe, I have a condition called cervical dystonia, which is an involuntary turning of the neck. God knows how I got this. This is another one of these interesting existential challenges, could say hex, on a bad day that I've had. And it's been a great learning experience, and it's been tough at the same time. But I'm so glad, I'm so grateful that I had all this background in this work. And existential philosophy and therapy, in addition to my own therapies, have all really prepared me to the degree I could be for this.
So what would a reader find in Rediscovery of Awe?
So my hope is that the reader would find that they too can learn to be with their deepest dreads, their fears of the groundlessness of existence. I do think that a lot of our so-called psychiatric disorders or troubles have to do with kind of at the core that there is no actual support except the support that we can make between ourselves as communities and within. We can find a ground within groundlessness. So my hope is that they would learn that and learn that at any moment they could be available to a sense of awe toward living. They could be available to something that lifts them to the bigger picture of life, which is incredible. And if you really dwell on it, it's incredible. We're hurtling through time and space. 1.2 million miles per hour to a destination that's completely unknown. I mean, we all are, metaphorically, we're on and literally, we're on a spaceship together, moving into the unknown. What can be discovered with that? What about just the feeling of being together on that ship? Something like being on a great hike, in the dark wood. It's terrifying at one level, or certainly unsettling, but that's also what lends its fascination and its excitement.
Is that why you call it spirituality of awe?
Yes, there's definitely one reason I call it spirituality of awe. Because it's not about a set of doctrines. It's about a sensibility of really taking this relationship to mystery seriously and allowing it to inform as many moments of our lives as possible. And to me, that's spirituality. It's our relationship to the cosmos, to existence, and how we experience that with our whole bodily being, not just our heads.
You talk about phone addiction, and I guess the speed of the internet, I guess, at this time. How do you see that as relevant?
I think it's relevant because my worry is that especially the youth, who I also think are great in so many ways, and I have a 24-year-old son who reminds me every day of the greatness of youth. Not the things he says, just his being and his friends' way of being. But it does really concern me that many are so wedded to these devices. And as my comedy club owning cousin put it, so much of our worlds have been reduced to 4-inch screens. But all we need do is to look up and witness the greatest show on earth. And I get from that the people around us, the life around us, the cosmos. So that's part of my concern, is how it can close off or kind of preset the parameters of our experience of living. And I think virtual reality can do that too. I mean, these devices and these modes can have an opening up effect for sure. There is that side. But it seems like something of a vicarious way of living, perhaps, rather than more direct and intimate way of living. I also get concerned that the preoccupation with machines may limit our ability to find agency in ourselves. So it will be more and more the machine that did it. And it's very seductive because we love to have instant results and have things tell us, give us information, guide us, produce things very quickly. However, what are we missing? That's one of my big questions in the spirituality of Oz. What are we missing? What do we want to preserve? And the third thing is the sense of dignity. If it's all basically coming from the mechanical, that which makes us happy or gives us pleasure, how are we going to feel, or how do we feel about ourselves if we're just empty vessels for these mechanical devices? And also the importance of accomplishing something ourselves, because it becomes the machine that does the accomplishment. Like I have in my book, the conversation with a fellow who says, he's sort of devil's advocate. He says, if I could be a virtuoso musician and I could pop a pill or have a brain implant that would make me such, I'd do it in a minute. And then I stop him, Joe. I say, yeah, okay, I could see the great appeal of that. But how would you feel internally if you knew that it was the pill or the implant that did it? And how would that affect your music too? Doesn't great music, or even moving music or art or any kind of craft or production, have a lot to do with what that person is bringing to it, and the intensity of that person in the work and the struggle of that person with the work? I mean, can you imagine a Beethoven who created these symphonies from synthesizers? Maybe so, because they actually have studies that show people can't tell the difference at times between mechanically made music and actual human-made music. But I wonder, I really wonder. I think maybe this is where we need to go more in depth of how the machine model for living is being internalized and shaping the new direction of the human being.
Well, from research, it seems that these devices are actually promoting depression, isolation, and listening to you, it makes me think that awe is discovered in the natural world.
To a great extent, nature is a conduit for awe, for sure. But I don't like to limit awe to any particular setting. And that's why I'm not a Luddite in this work either, because I believe that computers and virtual realities, some of these machines, could bring us a sense of discovery and venturing into the unknown. It's just that I think we have to be careful about how far they can take us and about not confusing the map with the territory. Because our raw contact with nature, with ourselves, with each other, that's all wide open. That's the full mystery, it seems to me. The other is to some degree calculated and pre-programmed. And of course, in the wrong hands, in unethical hands, it becomes propaganda or profiteering or manipulation. So that's a lot of what I'm calling for too, is a meta-awareness of what's going on in this machine-driven world.
In working with clients, how would you suggest cultivating a sense of awe? And how important is that?
Presence, I believe, is foundational. And I think it's foundational to cultivating a sense of awe. If you can't really be present, if you are in a continual panic or you're in fear, fear often brings the opposite of, or contrast with awe, which I call polarization. It narrows perception. It fixates on one thing to the utter exclusion of other possible things. Because we withdraw into a shell. So, the capacity to be with one's, again, fuller ranges of thoughts, feelings, body sensations, imaginings. Certainly meditation, I know mindfulness is something that you've cultivated deeply, could be a part of that. I believe in an everyday practice with presence. I think practice is key to that. Having a model for that can certainly be critical, like a good therapist or maybe a teacher of some kind who embodies that. Can be very helpful in the learning of that. And presence is the base from which then one can feel free or freer to experience life in its variety. You know?
Life in its awesomeness.
Yes, in its awesomeness. And its continually evolving awesomeness. If you can't stay with that, hard to stay with awe, really. I mean, you know, it's gonna be a closed off experience.
I guess there's no awe without presence.
That's my feeling. That's my feeling, yeah.
Can we talk about the Polarized Mind book? What would
Sure,
you say
sure.
people will get from that book? It came out 6 years ago. And, what can they find in the Polarized Mind, and what would be helpful for them in understanding what you're trying to relay in that book?
Well, I think it's directly relevant today, even though it came out several years ago. Really what I'm homing in on in that book is how generation after generation, and this dates back to Babylonian myth, you know, the first recorded literature, myths, we never seem to learn the problem with a fear-based society. And whether that manifests as hubris, as the Greeks put it, or overreaching, as happened in Gilgamesh, his attempt to reach immortality, but realizing that that all crumbled and he was not able to do that, he was not fit for that. Or Tiamat, the goddess, who couldn't stand the idea of her kids taking over and changing things, to the kinds of fear-based societies that we see now. And most of the power centers have been very fear-based throughout history. But in terms of our own situation here in the US, the Western world, I think we've been operating to a great extent on what I call the chaos complex. Foucault talks a lot about this in his own way, but that turn away from our primal relationship to existence and to nature. We had some damn good reasons for that. I think it happened soon after the, quote, Dark Ages. The pestilence, the criminality, the ignorance, the brutality of that time wiped out a third of Europe, leprosy colonies all over. So a lot of motivation to create a more rational and scientific mentality. But a huge question is, did we throw the baby out with the bathwater? And I think a good case can be made that we're still laboring under this chaos complex, and that we have been throwing the baby out with the bathwater more and more. And now that we're in positions to sanitize the world and to hyper-regulate the world like no other time in history, virtually to play God, that it's so extremely seductive that we may fixate on not just acting like machines, but becoming machines.
So as we come up to 2020, how would you say the polarized mind informs what we have coming up?
Well, it's a lot of the problem now is the way we are both driven toward simple answers and quick fixes, and we're being manipulated in that direction by our leaders in many cases, by the media that's controlled by certain powerful interests. And so we get locked in. We're in our own echo chambers in many cases. So we're reinforcing a certain polarized mentality, the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view, the fear of the other. I think all these things are at play, and if we don't address fear and helplessness and vulnerability, then we're going to stay on that same track because it's so darn seductive, and we now have the equipment to almost completely enter into that world of living in a kind of a one-way, hyper-regulated, puritanical, sanitized existence. And we're going to lose, a lot of the awesomeness of learning about each other, of discovering more of life. And so this is where I also have been increasingly involved in political and social stands. The last 6 months, I've joined a group called Better Angels, which is a grassroots movement that has now swept through 30 plus states. And we have a local San Francisco group. And it's all about bringing liberals and conservatives together for very structured, supportive, living room style dialogues, where you're not talking through phones or instant images per se. You're facing each other, you're sitting in a close space, and you're sharing not just your views about things, but your humanity. Like there's a lot of side talks about, I met several people from my hometown talking about going to football games together when we were kids, and how this brought the whole town together where it was otherwise very segregated, talking about blacks and whites. And God, what a difference that made in just being able to be with each other and see the humanity of each other. So I believe very strongly in this kind of movement. And I hope that will be a counterbalance, where people will realize how critical it is for us to face each other in relatively non-mediated ways. I think that's a lot of the key to living more vital, awe-based lives. and for us to do this with ourselves, in cultivating presence, however one does that.
So, thank you for this awe-inspiring conversation, Kirk.
Thank you for facilitating it, Donna.
Thank you for watching this video presentation by University Professors Press. We encourage you to support authors and small publishing companies by purchasing directly from the publisher or through local independent bookstores. All books published by University Professors Press are available on our website at www.universityprofessorspress.com. You can receive a 10% discount on all our products using the coupon UPPVideo at checkout. That's UPPVIDEO. Follow University Professors Press on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram for information about new releases and special offers.